You are listening to Talking Star Wars. Hello, I'm Connor.
And I'm Alex.
We're going to talk about some Star Wars related topics today.
This is what we normally do, and I believe why you're here.
Yes. So today we're going to focus in on the expanded universe. The expanded universe is anything outside of typical film canon for Star Wars.
And even outside the shows.
Mhm.
So sometimes some people would say the shows are part of the EU, the new EU, and they're correct. But there's also these other works that compromise the Star Wars canon,
Yeah.
from novels to comics to video games. And we're going to talk about all of those, as we said previously. But there's a lot out there, even just in the new canon.
Mhm. And some would even argue that TV shows are kind of where Star Wars exists nowadays, so it's not even so much the expanded universe anymore as it is just the universe. But we're going to take a look specifically today at the books, and I enjoy reading a book or two in my time, but I am not as voracious of a reader as Alex is, and he has done quite a lot of work in getting caught up with all of the canon novels in the new Star Wars backstory, back canon.
The Star Wars mythos universe
Yes.
franchise. So Connor will be my co-pilot today, and he'll prompt me with questions. We wanted to review the first few years of the new canon, and as many of you are probably aware, when Disney purchased Star Wars in 2014, the canonicity in the EU was a mess in a multi-tiered system.
Mhm.
It has been slightly better under Disney, but they wanted a fresh slate when they
Mhm.
started. So everything published before the Disney takeover, except for the Clone Wars and the original six movies, or the original two trilogies,
Mhm.
was declared non-canon. It's in its own continuity. There's still some great stuff in there, and there's still some of it that I think they're going to slowly bring back into canon.
Mhm.
But we are going to focus on the novels that were published following Disney's acquisition. As you'll see, they're often broken into discrete areas where they are tie-in. Some are tie-in materials leading up to other shows and other movies, and some are just standalone expansions, and they are of highly variable quality,
Mhm.
highly variable importance to the Star Wars canon.
Mhm.
But a lot of them are also very good. So the purpose of today is to give everyone a flavor of the type of the works that are out there in release order, and to give you some basic information. So Connor will give you the criteria by which we are going to discuss each work.
So Alex is going to kind of guide us through and give us the title, a description of what's going on in the story along with the primary characters, let us know how it fits in with the timeline, and then let us know who would enjoy this, who's the target audience. From there, we'll rank on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being Bantha fodder, 5 being an Imperial Nabooian cruiser, good. And then, is it important in the Star Wars canon? Because it could be a quality piece of media, but you can enjoy it on its own without having to worry about your Han Solos, your Finns, your BB-8s.
Yeah, and then some might be of limited artistic ability,
Mm-hmm.
but might provide some great information about the canon in general. And so I know that is of some. I prefer when it is both,
Mm-hmm.
but we want to distinguish it by here it is as a work of fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and here it is as a work of Star Wars media.
Right. Very different things.
All right. There are several places you can find lists of the new canon materials. There's Wikipedia, of course, has a great list. Wikipedia will have lists, though they're a little bit stodgier in how they
Mm-hmm.
organize information. TV Tropes has a fairly fan oriented list that is fairly straightforward. And then there's Disney themselves has a list of all of their works as well, though Disney is always trying to sell them to you. So they might not
Yeah.
they might have their most recent or most profitable things front and center.
Mm-hmm.
But with all that preamble out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Starting in 2015 with the first works that were released in Star Wars canon as novels after Disney had purchased the property.
Let's begin.
Yeah, so the first three works we're going to talk about today were leading up to the Rebels TV show, which we'll talk about separately, but which has some low points, but by the time it matured through its four seasons was one of the best works of Star Wars fiction and on par with the Clone Wars in quality, and has some very interesting characters and works and tie-ins that I believe are now showing up in The Mandalorian and in other media. But they released three tie-in materials, most of which were probably already in the hopper before Disney bought them, and as the Rebels TV show had been in the works before Disney bought Star Wars
Oh, I didn't
as
even know
well.
that. Yeah, I thought that was a Disney decision because I thought it was a matter of we're going to finish Clone Wars, start a new show. But it's interesting to know that there is some Dave Filoni lead-in prior.
Yeah, so maybe we'll look at the exact timeline of how that happened. But either Disney greenlit it and rushed it out, or they were kept the pre-production show because it
Mhm.
takes a long time to make an animated show like
Oh yeah,
Rebels. So I'm fairly certain that it was in the works significantly before Disney purchased Star Wars.
sure.
So the first work we're going to talk about today is called Ezra's Gamble. So this is a direct prequel to the first season, the first episode even, of the Rebels TV show. The main characters are Ezra Bridger, one of the main characters of Rebels, and Bosk, the famous Trandoshan bounty hunter.
Lizard Man, Lizard Man for the layman's, and The Empire Strikes Back, Lizard Man.
Yeah, he appears on the bridge as one of the bounty hunters hired along with Boba Fett, and yeah, he's had a significant expanded universe
Mhm.
presence. He's probably the most prominent Trandoshan characters as this brutal
Mhm.
bounty hunter, and he also appears in the Clone Wars.
Mhm.
So Ezra's Gamble is a YA novel. In fact, it's probably younger YA. As a starting point into the Star Wars canon, it's fairly mm, it's all right as a novel. So in it, it's a fairly straightforward story between Imperial overreach and presence on the planet of Lothal. Ezra is this young grifter who's trying to earn a quick buck and ends up having to team up with Bosk to do so. Bosk is a famous bounty hunter who's down on hard times because of the paucity of bounties in the
Mhm.
Empire, and a bunch of corrupt Imperial officials on Lothal who are all trying to line their own pockets. So it's setting up the late stage Imperial corruption on outlying planets, and then establishing the initially selfish character of Ezra Bridger and his attempts to grift and gain more money.
This is essentially a Star Wars Aladdin in the beginning. Like if as far as how his character is designed,
He's not nearly as likable as Aladdin either. I mean, he's an orphan and he has trauma, and that displays itself in a sort of selfishness and an always wanting to get one up on other people, and a difficulty showing trust.
mhm.
Uh,
So this sets up the flaws that he has to overcome in Rebels.
Yes.
Mhm.
So this takes place about 5 to 6 years before the Battle of Yavin. It takes place like in the month before the first episode of the Rebels TV show. Like the last chapter of the novel is a novelization of Ezra's part in one of the first episodes of the show.
Nice.
So it pretty much leads directly up to that. We get a sense of his character and we get some interesting world building about Lothal. As far as a work of fiction, I would give this a 2.5 stars. It's not badly written,
Mhm.
but there's nothing special about the prose. It's especially meant for younger readers. So a younger reader who particularly enjoys Rebel, perfect for them.
Mhm.
If you're looking for any kind of deep thematic exploration as a work of art, it's not there. And even as a work of YA, as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, uh, it's not particularly compelling in that
Not
way
a
either.
not a deep well to pull characterization from.
No, there's some fun moments with Bosk and the kind of technology and weaponry as around his frustration with not having access to all of his tools. Ezra, you know, figuring out this Imperial conspiracy, and then just getting some of these like slimy characters who are impersonating people and trying to cover their tracks. So there's an enjoyable conspiracy element to that, but it's not particularly deep. The characters are mostly straightforward caricatures. The big evil Imperial official, the scrappy, young, selfish Ezra, Bosk, who's just there to do his job and get home, and has
Mhm.
this uneasy alliance with Ezra. So, as a work of fiction, yeah, I would say 2 to 2.5 stars. Importance of the Star Wars canon, I'm going to rate it similarly at probably 2 stars. Uh, the Bosk tie-in and the events of this novel, other than providing some characterization for the planet of Lothal and for Ezra, you really don't need any of it. It didn't really expand my understanding of Ezra as a character at all. Probably the most important world building that it did was in the background, talking about the Bounty Hunters Guild and other
Mhm.
areas. It did not do anything special otherwise to make me think, now reading this, I have a greater understanding of Ezra as a character.
Sure. So taking a look at this book, if it's not the greatest as far as inclusion into the Star Wars universe or just as a work of fiction itself, who would you recommend it to?
So anyone who really loves the Rebels TV show and you have a spare afternoon to get through a YA novel, it's a couple hundred pages, and yeah, a couple hundred easy pages. Go right ahead. If you want to see more of Bosk, he gets some cool moments here. You know, want to know more about bounty hunters, or if it's a younger reader who really also likes the Rebels TV show, or a younger reader who's just looking to get into Star Wars in general. If you are like many of our readers, like a 30-something adult, if you want to be a completionist, there's nothing wrong with this novel.
Mhm.
Like I did not regret reading it, and it was fine. And I was like, yeah, that was pretty good. Looking to see what's going next, but I didn't like put it down like, this was an amazing novel.
Okay. So it's a little flat out of the gate, but it kind of gives us a good establishment of what's going to make for some quality storytelling versus maybe some necessary storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So, any thoughts on Ezra's Gamble before we move on to the next Rebels tie-in?
No, so yeah, Ezra's Gamble was a mediocre start. I'll straight up and say it was a mediocre book, but it was trying its best and it was working well within the canon of the TV show that it was tying into. That's probably the strength in that it showed this commitment to, as much as possible, using the works to expand on and further introduce other characters and aspects to the story.
Gotcha. So it's fair, average, somewhat below average.
But I would say mediocre. Yeah,
Mhm.
2 stars.
2 stars. Fair enough. So, what does our next novel tie in?
So our next novel is A New Dawn, which is the second of our three books or series tying into the Rebels TV show. This one is how the characters of Hera Syndulla and Kanan Jarrus met. For those who haven't watched Rebels, I don't want to spoil too much, but Kanan Jarrus is a Jedi Padawan who survived Order 66 and is hiding his identity from the Empire. And Hera Syndulla is the daughter of Twi'lek resistance leader from Ryloth, Cham Syndulla. So Hera Syndulla is his daughter.
He appeared in a few episodes of Clone Wars. That was his
Correct.
major
And in the Bad Batch
focus.
now, we see a young Hera. And Hera is a young rebel leader trying to make contact with potential other rebels and formulate a cell. And A New Dawn also introduces several antagonists that are also interesting to watch, and there are different aspects of the Empire. You have Tarkin lurking a little bit in the background, but primarily the two antagonists of this novel to be concerned about are Count Vidian, who is a cyborg capitalist
Hmm.
who has convinced the Empire that he is the person that can get the maximum productivity out of a planet. And the planet that A New Dawn takes place on has an important mineral and crystal necessary for the creation of Star Destroyer turbo lasers. And
Oh.
so production and mining conditions have already been deteriorating, and Count Vidian is sent in to double production as much as possible in a fairly flagrant act of short term exploitation by fairly much destroying the entire ecosystem of a moon and a planet and endangering all of the workers. Also, the first introduction of an antagonist who is going to run throughout a lot of this expanded universe material, who I've really hoped that they show in live action one day. That is Ray Sloan, who in this series is Captain Ray Sloan, and she eventually becomes Grand Admiral Ray Sloan by the time we get to after the Battle of Endor. So she is temporarily assigned to the captainship of the Star Destroyer that Count Vidian is given for his use, and she is the one who is helping to hunt down our protagonists as the story goes on.
Gotcha.
So in the timeline, this is probably taking place 10-ish years before the Battle of Yavin. It's not exactly clear. The Death Star is well under construction, but none of the people in the novel know that it's being created. And the big focus were primarily in the heads of those four characters: Count Vidian, Ray Sloan, Kanan Jarrus, and Hera Syndulla. Kanan is hiding his identity for the entire novel, uh, and we do not see him use his lightsaber at all. He is
Mhm.
tempted and he has it, but he doesn't. He uses the. But probably the most interesting part of Kanan's character in this book is it shows how hard it is for a Jedi to hide.
Mhm.
Because whatever he does, whether it's being a shuttle pilot, being a driver, being a bouncer, he excels at it. The Force is always his ally, and
Mhm.
he can't really turn that off. And he has not done what people like Yoda and Obi-Wan and others do by cutting himself off from the Force or isolating himself. So because He still has the Force as his ally, and he's out among society. It cannot help but be his ally, and so he always has to eventually move on because it becomes obvious that there's something exceptional about him in a way where the Inquisitors might come break down his door at some point.
Yeah, I was gonna say it seems like it would put him in a pretty vulnerable situation where he would draw attention to himself.
Yeah, and he does end up using the Force several times in the novel with witnesses,
Hmm.
though Hera is never quite certain who he is, and Hera distrusts him because he's sort of a playboy, go with the flow adrenaline junkie for most of this book. Kanan has deliberately abandoned any kind of higher ideals as a survival mechanism,
Hmm.
whereas Hera is very committed to the cause of the rebellion, and she's then, through circumstances, they are thrown together to work together, and they end up growing closer.
You can kind of see why Kanan and Ezra would get along in the show if they're both coming from this point of orphaned, abandoned, having to shape new, somewhat selfish ideals as a coping mechanism. It would make them a very non-traditional, but still, um, what's the word I'm thinking of? Uh, Compatible master and apprentice.
Yeah, though certainly they don't start out as compatible because they
Hmm.
each have issues to work through.
Sure.
But this doesn't. I would say this does a great job of introducing these characters, and I would rank it more highly than the last novel we just talked about. This is a full-length adult novel.
Gotcha.
Introduces a lot of characters, has a strong beginning, rising action, complications, battles,
Hmm.
quiet moments, loud moments. So this was a more solid entry into the prequels, Rebels. So as far as a work of fiction, it's still finding its feet, but I'd give this a 3.5 or a 4 maybe out of 5 stars. We'll say 3.5.
Hmm.
It's still finding its feet, but it's solid and it's interesting and it does interesting. The character work is the strongest part of it.
Excellent.
And as far as its importance to the canon, I would say that this does more world building than the first novel, A New Dawn. I would say if you want to know how Kanan and Hera got so close in Rebels, this is going to be how it introduces to you. And if you want a strong thematic sense of the kind of ecological devastation that and even incompetence that the fascist empire is encouraging, this also does a much more world building.
And I'm guessing that's also reflected in Rebels itself, where we get to see the inadequacy of the Empire.
Yeah, you see both the best and worst of the empire in A New Dawn, where Count Vidian is a
Mm,
fraud and Ray Sloane is ambitious and competent, and how the system they are in brings out the worst in both of them.
gotcha.
So as far, yeah, and then to go back to who I believe this novel would be for, I would say anyone who's a fan of the Rebels TV show should watch this,
Mhm.
or who wants. You could even read it before watching Rebels, if you're planning to. It's not going to spoil anything for you. And for anyone who loves to see a hidden Jedi after Order 66 story, if you love Fallen Order, you'll like seeing Kanan Jarrus, who's a little bit older than Cal Kestis. And if you like intrigue, battles, exploding planets, star destroyers, political intrigue, and a strong, I would say, ecological, let's protect our environment and give our workers some rights is a strong theme running throughout this novel as well.
Small sidebar: planetary destruction is definitely a topic that we should get into at some point in the Star Wars universe.
Certainly,
Yeah.
everything from the Death Star to Operation Cinder
Hmm.
to ecological destruction by out of control fascist industry.
Fracking. So, uh, 1 to 1, I would say one high quality, one semi quality. Taking a look at this next piece, it says it's about a character named Zara Leonis, but even in my cursory knowledge of Rebels, I have no idea who Zara Leonis is. So,
So the next one, so this is broken into four YA novels. It's really one story. Servants
mhm.
of the Empire, and there are four. It's almost like Lord of the Rings is 6 books,
Mhm.
but it's really one book written into 6 sections.
Sure.
Servants of the Empire is a YA 4 volume set, but it's one novel.
Mhm.
And this is showing one of the most interesting parts of the EU in that it takes a very minor character from Rebels, Zer Leonis, who appears in 1 to 2 episodes of the first season and doesn't appear again till much later. And it expands on his story as a vehicle by which to explore other themes and other happenings in a focused way. So this, even though it is another YA novel, it is much improved over Ezra's Gamble, and I highly enjoyed it.
So, in what ways would you say it's uh, a step up?
So we're continuing our theme, as you can tell. The Rebels TV show, the Rebels show, has a strong, I would say, environmentalist message throughout, and Servants of the Empire is continuing that because it shows through the eyes of Zara Leonis, who by the time the novel starts, the first novel really gets into everything surrounding the events of uh, the TV show, where he's already on his way to being radicalized after the disappearance of his sister, who has vanished during her Imperial cadetship, and his whole family are loyal Imperials, and he himself is a loyal Imperial. But then slowly over the course, as he sees, oh, uh, I'm at the academy and I have friends with aliens, and I've been being told not to hang out with these aliens. You see, it's almost like he's almost in like the Hitler Youth version of the Empire, where it's like
Hmm.
stop associating with the aliens, conform to our doctrine. Oh, those are a lesser people, and you can see how if he didn't have this outside influence of his missing sister to guide him, he might have fallen prey to that kind of indoctrination. And in fact, he still struggles against it. Zara Leonis does. So it does one of my favorite things that you where it uses a mostly new character and expands upon. You get more of the culture of Lothal, from its fields and its festivals and even its companies, its technology, and then uses him to introduce other characters. His girlfriend is a nascent slicer, and we see her getting involved in the underworld that's resisting the Empire. We see the ISB taking interest, the Imperial Security Bureau taking interest in subversive activities, and we even see the Grand Inquisitor show up hunting for sensitive children, continuing that theme from Rebels as well.
So, as far as the grand scheme of these four books, are they pretty close together as far as chronology goes, or are they spaced throughout the Rebel series?
They're really they all take place before, during, and immediately after. In fact, before and during the first season of Rebels.
Okay.
The character of Zara Leonis does appear later in Rebels, but this series of books is very tightly focused on the growing Imperial presence on Lothal that informs season two then of Rebels. Because the Grand Inquisitor, they run from him in the final book, and he appears in the final episode of Rebels.
Hmm.
So he's still around, and it even ties into some very important themes from episode 7, 8, and 9, because the eventual, when Zara Leonis goes into a higher academy, he goes on Arcanus, and the commandant of Arcanus is Brendel Hux,
Hmm.
who is the father of General Hux, the one of the leaders of the First Order.
Armitage, as
Armitage,
we
yes.
found.
We even meet a young 6-year-old Armitage, I believe. Zara Leonis meets him in this novel. So it does a lot of world building and connectivity.
It's very interesting, especially for a YA novel. We're getting to see the protagonist within the Empire. We're able to get their mindset, able to understand their motivation, which has been done in Legends books and comics, but so far in new canon, we haven't really seen that. Uh, we see that with the New Order and Finn, but we don't get to see that so much yet with the Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. One thing to be aware for a potential reader, there is a whole subplot about high school athletic activity. It's called Grav Ball. It's totally football. So it is not the most compelling part of the novel,
mhm,
but it is used as a vehicle by which to show discrimination against other
mhm,
races. Whereas Zara Leonis, he wants his, one of his favorite, I'll call him the running back. They don't call him the running back.
mhm,
Is an Ithorian. He's like, no, can't have him. He's an alien. He needs to
mhm.
start passing the ball to these solid human, Aryan, oh, sorry, Imperial citizens. So
Yeah.
it is the, at least, even though I believe the author was told, yeah, you got to put in a football subplot to make this relatable to the youths.
Mhm.
It is does manage to even do something interesting with that, and it
That's
gives
good at
him,
least.
yeah, and he's like a teenager, and he has a girlfriend he hides from his parents, and even that uses, oh, but she's a secret slicer who's helping him evade the Empire, but then is way out of her league
Mhm.
and is being hunted by the ISB. So even with all of the stereotypical teenage YA tropes that this does engage in, it's doing interesting things in the Star Wars universe.
Gotcha. So, as far as how it ranks as just fiction itself and how it fits in with the Star Wars universe, how would you stack this?
So I have to rank this as a work of YA because
Mhm.
you have to always consider what genre it's going in.
Sure.
So whereas the Ezra's Gamble I rated as a 2 for Way. I would rate this one a 4. It's not perfect. There are certain areas for improvement. The prose could be better, but as far as being interesting for a younger reader and still having things for an older reader, I'd rate this a solid 4 out of 5 myself for the quality as a work of fiction.
And yeah, if it can make Grav Ball sound interesting,
It's still the
all the
weakest part of
power
the
for
novel. Let's be honest. The Grav Ball plot is not my favorite,
it. Sure.
but
It's kind of like Quidditch and Harry Potter. It's there. It's compelling, but it's not exactly the wizarding that you signed up for, at least in my opinion.
yeah. And as far as the importance of canon, you do not need to have read this to understand how Zare Leonis is operating in the Rebel show. So you don't. This would not be required reading of. Oh, I must understand everything. But as a work of world building, I would say that this is a strong section. You see the first how an imperial presence overwhelms a planet, how the ISB tracks people, the rise of organized crime underneath that. You even see how washed up cadets are then inducted into the stormtrooper program and are conditioned to only respond to their numbers. So it does a lot of like even these direct parallels to like almost this Hitler Youth movement,
Mhm.
where you see how they control, radicalize, and indoctrinate younger characters.
Which is pretty serious for a YA novel. It's kind of reminds me of Ender's Game.
It's very similar, I was
Mhm.
thinking, theme and tone to Ender's Game, where just because it has short, straightforward prose, the subject matter does not shy away from being rather adult and serious.
Okay.
So,
This is an interesting one because it is YA. It's not for our, average us 30-year-old audience, but it does seem compelling. So who would you recommend it to?
yeah. So, again, if you're looking for beautiful prose, other than some descriptions and some interesting, I mean, the dialogue is sparse, made for a younger audience. But if you're really into Star Wars world building, this is great. And if you really were intrigued by that subplot of Zare Leonis going undercover as a cadet in Rebels, go ahead and read it. But again, they're mostly using him as a vehicle through which to show how the imperial power structure takes over and subverts a planet. So I would say this is good for a younger reader. I would say any younger reader would love this series, especially since it's broken into 4 parts. It's very digestible.
Perfect for me. I might have to take this one up.
Yeah, but then I would say anyone else who really enjoys world building for its own sake and wants to see Lothal as like this microcosm study of the negative effects the Empire has on a society.
So, moving on to our next collection, we're transitioning from Rebels tie-ins. What would you categorize this next group as being? Is it lead-in to A New Hope, or is it kind of a lead-in to A New Hope, but also pieces of fiction that kind of fill the spaces between it movies?
So I would say that the next series of the several novels we're going to discuss are sort of a grab bag. I
Mhm.
think these are the first few novels that Disney commissioned directly, and they mostly fill in gaps with well known characters already in various areas. So these are either scripts or books or pitches I think that Disney might already had, and they
Mhm.
picked what they liked best. And I think just to get some of their most popular characters back out there.
Mhm.
But even then, so we're going to talk about in a minute, Lost Stars was entirely new characters and was
Mhm.
primarily a love story. Whereas the one we're about to talk about, Tarkin, is the first of what I'll call the villain novels, where it is focusing heavily on an antagonist,
Mhm.
and they are a villainous protagonist in their own story, and you see how they got to where they were, what built their worldview, and how they reached the position that they did.
And the first novel, which is Tarkin, is focusing on Grand Moff Tarkin, one of the more famous villains in the original trilogy. He's the primary villain, I would say, in A New Hope. Uh, it's kind of arguable as to whether Darth Vader is subservient or if they're on the same playing field.
Darth Vader is certainly hierarchically subservient to Tarkin at the point of A New Hope.
Yeah.
Leia even refers to Tarkin holding his leash.
Hmm.
Vader is not given pure political power until after the destruction of the first Death Star and the desperation of that time.
Sure.
So this is showing how Grand Moff Tarkin, or Governor Tarkin, as he also liked to be addressed, it's giving his backstory, how he became such a proponent of the Empire, how he became the kind of cold individual who could order the destruction of Alderaan, and using him also to show how certain planets folded into the Imperial umbrella, and how his personal relationship with Palpatine was so important to his rise.
Mhm.
So, ostensibly, the book takes place a few years before A New Hope, before the Battle of Yavin, showing Tarkin battling a rebel cell that is getting in on his. He is currently at this point the commandant of the Death Star project, Project Stardust, and it's very secret. And some people are obviously trying to trace shipments and are attacking his shipments, and they even steal his personal shuttle
Hmm.
with all of its stealth technology to do it, the Carrion Spike. But that's about half the novel. The rest we get flashbacks from Tarkin's perspective to his childhood, uh, exploring several subplots from the first for how he hunted down a pirate queen to how he was raised in this big game hunting family with this sort of brutalist, uh, only the strong survive mindset. And so you see underlying this civilized, cultured manner that Tarkin presents, he is truly like this frontier survivor,
Mhm.
big game hunter, outdoorsman with this dog eat dog, only the strong survive background and worldview.
I'm picturing that personification through the acting of Peter Cushing, because Peter Cushing was a phenomenal actor. He was in a series of Hammer horror movies as both Van Helsing and Dr. Frankenstein, and he just carried those movies with his charisma despite their kind of dated quality. And it's very fitting to see him as this big game hunter. And I'm pretty sure there's a comic book that reflects this sort of brutalism where he has a petty officer beneath him who starts giving him lip, and so he just challenges him to unarmed combat.
So he does that. Recently read that one. So that's
Mhm.
all in his head. So,
Okay.
but he there's a petty officer giving him lip, and he just wishes that he was back on his home planet and he could just rip off his uniform and challenge him to a knife fight to the death.
Hmm.
He doesn't because he is intelligent and ruthless and doesn't want to compromise the authority of his position, and he knows the value. But beneath the sneering imperial, um, I would say, arrogance and this cold ruthlessness that Tarkin always exudes, he's calculating, but there's also this ability to burn hot if he needs to. There's a reason it doesn't bother him to love Alderaan. Alderaan was too weak to defend itself.
Hmm.
It's not He's not doing this out of pure loyalty to the Empire. He's doing it because it fits into his pre-existing worldview.
Hmm.
And Sheev Palpatine recognizes this because this even ties into how Tarkin is depicted in the Clone Wars when we see him as Captain Tarkin
Hmm.
and is rescued from a prison as he's a officer in the Army of the Republic. So he had a pre-existing relationship with then Senator Palpatine, which then carries on to Chancellor Palpatine, which then carries on to Emperor Palpatine.
Hmm.
Tarkin has always been a close friend, or at least a political ally of him,
Hmm.
and Palpatine actually gives him advice on how, as a frontier governor, upcoming functionary, how he then leverages that into becoming a Grand Moff.
Hmm. And he, based on that description, seems very similar to Captain Phasma, where Captain Phasma has, if you watch or listen to our one of our previous episodes on the missed opportunities of Captain Phasma, she's very much has her own worldview, has her own modus operandi, and then works for the New Order, uh,
The First Order.
the
Yeah.
First Order, as a matter of fulfilling that. Where Moff Tarkin
Yeah.
seems to have that same sort of view.
But I would say Grand Moff Tarkin never questions his loyalty, and he never does
Mm-hmm.
anything that would question, certainly in this novel, his loyalty to the Empire. He buys in. He sees the Empire as the biggest game around, and his loyalty is never in question. Yeah, even as we go through the twists and turns of the novel about who is informing the rebels about these supply shipments, how does Tarkin go about fighting it off, and then we go back to his backstory where it reveals another part of his worldview. His He remains an antagonist, and the things that he does in the novel are certainly not laudable.
Mm-hmm.
The only enjoyable parts of the novel are that he is more competent than his uh, ultimate enemies, who are
Mm-hmm.
other conniving imperial officers.
Sure. They just don't have the patience or the viciousness to combat Tarkin.
Yeah, so you're not really rooting for Tarkin for most of the battle, sorry, for most of the novel, but you appreciate what he's doing and you understand why he's doing it.
Gotcha.
So as far as the timeline, yeah, it takes place, as I said, a few years before the Battle of A New Hope, but then flashes back to times during the Clone Wars and after various parts in Tarkin's life. As a work of fiction, it's a little bit. It has a little too many few too many subplots going. It's trying sometimes the subplots get a little disjointed, and it's like, oh, we just got back from a flashback from when he was 9, and then we're back in the modern day when old school stolen separatist fighters are attacking one of his command posts, and oh, well, now we're back in his head about this item. So probably the weakest part of the writing is that. But as far as the exploration of Tarkin as a specific character to show his worldview, is great. So I'll give it a 3.5 as a work of fiction.
Then fitting within the greater Star Wars lore, how does it fit? Is it necessary read? Is it does it add a lot of compelling characterization to Tarkin that helps us through A New Hope, Rebels, Rogue One?
I would say it makes the most sense to explain his actions less in A New Hope and more in Rogue One, where he seizes control of the Death Star from Director Krennic. And this shows how he's always had sort of the disdain for Krennic as a pencil pusher. He wouldn't survive a day in the bush.
Mm-hmm.
So he disdains Krennic and seizes control himself. So I would say if you're certainly a fan of a Clone Wars, this is good. It's for work, but do you really need to read Tarkin to understand the character? Not really.
Mm-hmm.
But is it enjoyable addition to the character, and does it do some good world building? Again, to show how men like Tarkin rise to prominence in the Empire. It's good in that sense.
Good to know.
And as far as who would enjoy the Tarkin novel, uh, well, this is certainly the most mature novel we talked about before. Tarkin, you know, at some point is in the bush with a knife and he's murdering animals,
Mm-hmm.
and lots of people die at Tarkin's hands. He sacrifices entire ships without a second thought. So this is certainly not for, you know, a reader who's not a teenager yet, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But if you really enjoy the character of Tarkin and you like seeing things through the eyes of the villains and understanding why they are like they are, you'll enjoy this novel. And if you just get a sense of these, there's almost a series of villain novels where we see through the eyes of Imperials the power structure and how that's working. So anyone who really enjoys the character of Tarkin or the Imperial period itself, or is just looking for a solid entry in the Star Wars canon, would enjoy Tarkin.
Good to know. Good to know. The next book doesn't really seem to fit in the same timeline. Uh, Heir to the Jedi looks to take place in between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. So who are we following around here?
So Luke Skywalker is the primary character of this story, and it's called Heir to the Jedi, and it is the first novel told in first person, entirely within Luke Skywalker's worldview. So, and it is set almost immediately after the destruction of the Death Star, when Luke finds himself adrift and without Obi-Wan Kenobi's guidance, but before the start of the Star Wars comic, where we see him being promoted to commander and engaging in a series of missions for the rebellion.
Where he's wearing his sweet yellow jacket from the ceremony on A New Hope.
Yeah, so um, so we see he does a lot in the period between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back. They have stuffed Luke's life to the brim. So this one is Luke grappling with that, but it's we see these other characters, a cryptographer, another rebel agent. He travels several planets that run into creatures. They're being hunted by bounty hunters. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. A lot happens in this, and it's almost Luke being used as a cipher to tell a story of the challenges of the rebellion during this period. It's a shorter novel. Uh, it's honestly a, it's almost a little bit forgettable,
Hmm.
I would say.
It's disappointing because Luke Skywalker is the flagship character of the franchise, and they're trying to reinvigorate the audience's love of the original trilogy. So you'd hope that in their first inclusion of Luke Skywalker, from his point of view, it would be an enthralling read.
So, what it felt like to me when reading Heir to the Jedi is that they really wanted to tell the story of these other characters,
Mm-hmm.
um, from the cryptography and the rebel agents and their various thoughts, but they wanted to do it through the eyes of a known character. So like this is a mission that Luke is sent on.
Mm-hmm.
So and we certainly it is true to Luke's character. He's very caring, compassionate, competent in that way, but also out of his depth
Mm-hmm.
and being in an organized military structure. So which
From
is
farm boy to soldier.
yeah, and
Yeah.
he's not treated initially with a lot of respect until
Mm-hmm.
people know that he's the But then he gets this immediate respect when people realize, oh, he's the guy that blew up the Death Star,
Mm-hmm.
and Luke is uncomfortable with that. So it does interesting work with Luke's character in that way. So yeah, I'm trying to remember even specific plot points to this one, and it's just
Yeah, if it's a struggle to come up with what's happening in the book, must not be the most memorable, uh, like I said, exhilarating piece of canon.
yeah. So one reason, just from the backstory of the publication, this was a book that was in the works before Disney acquired Star Wars. It was going to be the
Okay.
start of a series from Luke's perspective, but then it was repurposed into the new canon, and that kind of disjointedness uh, shows up in the novel. So
They could have possibly taken the threads of many novels in this series and tried to tie them together just to, I don't know, just to advertise it and get something out quick.
yep. This does introduce a few ongoing plot threads for Luke during this period, which are interesting. In that, there is this sort of almost love interest in the character of Fayette. So that's sort of, they have a thing for each other, and we see this with several other women, because Luke is attractive and powerful and loyal and honest, but it never ever quite works out with any of them for a variety of reasons.
Ah, shucks. I'm going to call that the ah, shucks phenomenon of Luke's character.
Yep, there's so from rescuing a cryptographer to going on various expeditions with predators where only the Force allows Luke to survive, to uh,
Stuff. He does
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, and so we see him working as a pilot. We see him trying to lay low. We see him running a blockade. Um, yeah, and then there's probably the most interesting part of the novel is a final showdown where there's bounty hunters that are after his group, but they're entirely unaware that Luke is the Force. Uh, Probably him grappling with the dark side is a compelling moment in
Hmm.
this novel, where it's calling to him to just use the Force to snuff out the life of these people hunting him down, and he has to
Hmm.
fight that off. Good foreshadowing.
Sure. Force shadowing.
Don't ever say that again. Yeah.
Oh. I watch 3 years from now, we're going to have the foreshadowing technique that Grogu, whatever. So, as far as like story structure, does this novel have a primary villain, like primary antagonist?
Not really. There's an Imperial
No.
Moff in the background who's ordering people around. There's some
Mhm.
specific bounty hunters that are hunting them down, but there's not really a single strong antagonist. There's these unnamed bounty hunters,
Mhm.
Weequay and Trandoshan and Aqualish, and there's this Moff who's on their tail, but there's not a specific villain antagonist that is present in throughout the whole thing.
Which could make it kind of weak. It doesn't have to be Vader. Doesn't even have to be the Grand Inquisitor, but just to have one single uh, pursuer who is giving Luke chase, something like that would just be nice, so that we know who to root against.
Yeah. So, as a work of fiction, I'm going to rate this one a three. It was competently written.
Mm.
There was nothing. It was the first work we've talked about that's written in first person, which is a very different approach. So we get everything entirely from Luke's perspective.
It's neat.
Yeah. So and it's a very personal way of seeing Luke grapple with the Force, which was an interesting part of the novel.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as its place as a world building measure in Star Wars, I'll rate it a little higher. I'll give it a 3.5 or a 4
Mm-hmm.
in that getting a first person insight into Luke's head about how he feels about people, how he's hesitant to fall in love and then does and then loses the person
Mm-hmm.
he's sort of has a thing for. See that already start to harden him a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
going from the farm boy we see in A New Hope to the still slightly gormless but fairly seasoned warrior
Mm-hmm.
and General Skywalker,
Mm-hmm.
that as we see in Empire Strikes Back, willing to go through Jedi training. So it's his first step down that path.
Yeah, it's always tricky because when I think, people will say, "Oh, we really need to have a Darth Vader show. We need to have a Luke Skywalker show." Like, didn't you get that with the film series? Like, it's all about Luke. It's all about Vader. So when you have a piece of media that's focused on them, it really has to do something different. in order to add to that canon of the character.
So as far as who would enjoy this, it's a quick read. It's and as the events it shows, it's again we're in the Imperial period, of and this is post Battle of Yavin. So if you really love the character of Luke Skywalker and you want to see him grappling with questions of love, the dark side, the Force from a very intimate internal perspective, this is a great novel. If you're looking for a thrilling plot with lots of twists and turns that make perfect sense, not exactly enough for you. The value in this one is primarily in seeing Luke's internal world,
Mhm.
and then a little bit in seeing how the Empire reacted to the destruction of the Death Star.
Join us next time for part 2 of our expanded universe overview. Thank you so much for listening. We've been talking Star Wars. We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.